Chapter 2. The Slayer of Beautiful Birds. Visits by relatives who are planning to spend the summer in Arvis, social gatherings, insurance issues for the trade ship to sail next month. Matthias, sitting at the backside of the carriage, stared outside the window as his butler Hessen reported the family's pending issues. Matthias replied to Hessen's words with a brief answer or a nod. The directors were in charge of the company, and Matthias's mother and grandmother were in charge of the family affairs. But the power to make the ultimate decision was up to Duke Gerhard, and Matthias has been in that position ever since he was 12 years old. By the time Matthias entered the Platanus Road to the Gerhard territory, Hessen's report was over. Matthias gazed at the familiar scenery with his head tilted at an angle. The tall trees that lined both sides of the driveway were arched, as if they were holding hands. The fragmented sunlight gliding through the swaying leaves embroidered the path like a beautiful pattern. Passing the road and into the territory, a white mansion with a deep blue roof had revealed itself. At the front door, the mother and grandmother were out to greet the family's head, while Matthias was straightening the position of his already linear tie. The door to the wagon opened.
Welcome, Matthias.
The Dowager Duchess of Arvis, Norma Katharina von Gerhard, greeted her grandson with a bright smile. Matthias bowed his head and accepted his grandmother's kiss. Elise von Gerhard, who was standing behind them, approached Matthias with a slightly more straightforward attitude.
You've grown taller.
She gave him a warm hug and smiled. Her dark black hair, just like her son's, shined in the early summer sun. Matthias replied with a corresponding smile. The greetings that were shared with the other servants who were waiting in line were not much different. Matthias's refined manner and proper courtesy were distinctly shown towards the servants. He was the perfect owner of this family, Duke Gerhard. Standing between his grandmother and mother, Matthias took the lead and crossed the lobby hall. Before he climbed up the stairs, he suddenly raised his head and looked up the huge chandelier that was lit up in the middle of the day. Beyond the chandelier was the crest of Hart family, imprinted on the ceiling. He was a Gerhard. It was another name for intelligence, elegance, and unrelenting character. In his own life, Matthias never had any complaints or doubts. He was well aware of the type of life he had to live in, and was willing to accept it. He handled his life as if he were breathing, and it was easy as that. With his gaze focused down, Matthias climbed up the stairs with large strides. When the owner of the household safely entered the mansion, the servants were now able to properly breathe. The people of Arvis prepared for days in advance to thoroughly greet Duke Gerhard. Everything and everyone had to be perfect on his arrival, including those who were residing on his land. The servants had to be on their best appearances. The Arvis's uninvited guest, Leila Llewellyn, was no exception.
Did the Duke go in already?
Leila, standing at the edge of the group of servants, whispered in a rather disappointed voice. The ivory dress that Bill had bought fluttered along with the girl's movement.
You'll see Duke Gerhard in the woods. I'll have to ask for permission then.
Bill Remmer gave out a blunt answer and started walking towards the woods. Leila ran after him.
Does the Duke like the forest as well?
Well, yeah, sure. He likes hunting.
Hunting? In the woods?
Leila's eyes grew wide open. Bill snorted as he glimpsed down the child.
Isn't it natural the forest is the hunting ground for this family?
Then, does he hunt birds too?
The Duke enjoys hunting birds the most.
Leila stopped walking in contemplation at Bill's insignificant remark. After realizing what he had said, Bill awkwardly gave out a dry cough. He thought of appeasing her with a proper lie, but Duke Gerhard was scheduled to be on the hunting ground in a couple of days. He was worried that he might give the child a greater shock if he tried to relieve her with his white lies.
You'll be surprised when you see the Duke's shooting skills. He's young, but he's a great marksman.
Bill babbled because he thought he had to say at least something to reassure the young girl. But Leila was already on the verge of tears.
Why does he like catching birds? There's lots of food in a mansion like that.
To the nobleman, hunting is just a form of leisure. Birds are the most interesting targets to shoot at, and
Bill once again realized what he had said and turned towards Leila. His eyes were met with Leila's upset face. "Why did you have to like birds so much?" Bill almost yelled out. He didn't know why he was bothering to explain all these things to her while having to be careful of the child's feelings. Bill ended up keeping his silence, because if he said one more word, she looked like she was about to cry. A crying Leila. He hated the sight of crying children. After hesitating, Bill started to walk again. The child followed his footsteps with her shoulders limp. The exact child who was excited to wear her new ivory-coloured dress was now nowhere to be found. It had been quite a sight to see her getting so jumpy about a dress she'd just got.
I hope the Duke starts to hate hunting.
The child, who had been silent for a long time, said cautiously,
Maybe he'll grow bored of hunting?
Leila looked up at Bill with eyes full of hope. Bill could only reply by sheepishly scratching the back of his neck. Leila believed her prayers could have been fulfilled. A week after his return, the Duke was nowhere to be seen near the hunting ground. It was understandable, because he was busy taking care of the guests who had flocked to the mansion to see him. Every day, there were clamorous gatherings held at the mansion, but the forest was silent. Summer was near its end. Baby birds hatched from the eggs and the wild roses, which used to be in their early buds, were now in full bloom. Leila happily observed the minor changes that were happening in the forest.
don't go too far, Leila.
Bill raised his voice when Leila excitedly left the cabin.
Okay, I'm just taking a walk by the river. See you later, Uncle.
Leila turned around and frantically waved both her arms over her head. The old leather bag the girl was holding over her shoulder shook along with the jumpy child. Leila was the first to see the recently hatched birds over the tree branch. The hairless baby birdlings were waiting for their mother to bring their food. Leila scurried down from the tree and recorded the baby birds she saw today on a small note taken out from her leather bag. Although the sketches were a bit messy, she tried her best to capture the tiny birds through her drawings. Leila drew and wrote everything she saw in the woods in her little notebook. The land was more beautiful than any other place she had ever lived in. Leila wanted to write down everything, so when the time for her to leave the place came, she could recall the memories she had in the forest through her notebook. The thought of leaving the place one day saddened her. As Leila walked along the path leading to the riverside, she steadily recorded the forest. She stuck in pastel-coloured flower petals between her notebook pages and picked some strawberries she found on the way. The sun was beginning to set when she reached the glistening riverside. Leila climbed on top of a massive tree that stood at the border of the forest and the river. The thick, lengthy branch of the tree was her favourite spot because it was as comfortable as a chair. Just when Leila was about to open her notebook, faint clatter of horseshoes was heard from afar. Leila hastily shoved her notebook into her bag. In the meanwhile, the galloping sound of the horse came closer. Frightened by the incoming intruder, Leila held her breath while hugging the tree branch she was laying down on. Soon after, a horse with a smooth, dark hazel fur appeared. A man was on its back. Of all places, the man chose to rest his horse right underneath the tree where Leila was on. The man's movements from when he descended from the horse were light and flexible. Leila believed she should come down, but the strange man was already leaning his back under the tree. Not knowing what other excuses to say, Leila simply stared at the man, raising his hand to take off his hat. It was at that exact moment when Leila's leather bag slid off her shoulders and hit the branch. The memory of the next moment was vague. The man reflectively turned his head towards the tree branch and met eyes with Leila. Leila gazed upon his eyes. His blue eyes, seen through the thick black hair flowing over his forehead, were like transparent glass beads. By the time Leila pulled herself together, the man was pointing his gun towards her face. Leila's face grew pale at the thought of getting shot by the long, threatening gun. Leila, frozen in place, simply hugged the tree for dear life. Her whole body was trembling in sweat. The man slowly gave off a silent sigh and lowered his gun.
What are you?
A low voice streamed through his crooked lips. Leila managed to squeeze her voice out, but was on the verge of tears. Her gold hair fluttered in the wind.
What?
His eyes narrowed further. Leila hugged the tree so hard that her fingertips began to hurt.
Leila Llewellyn. Uncle Bill. Uncle.
Leila's voice rang out in the woods. Bill was sitting in front of the cabin warehouse. He turned his head in bewilderment at Leila's frantic call. Leila rushed towards him with a crimson-red face.
What's the matter?
There's a man in the woods. He was tall.
Despite her shortness of breath, Leila was about to explain her encounter with the strange man.
You must have met the Duke who came out hunting.
Bill retorted as he picked up his tools from the warehouse.
His hair was black and his eyes were really blue. His voice was light as a feather.
It's Duke Earhart without a mistake.
Bill snarled with laughter. Leila stood in front of Bill for a long time, trying to catch her breath. The beautiful but scary man stared at Leila for some time and had turned away without saying a word. When he got back on his horse, 2 other men appeared from the deep forest. The man turned his horse to join the other 2 men as they drifted further into the woods. When they were no longer visible, Leila climbed down from the trees and fled to the cabin.
Then the Duke.
When Leila was able to say something, a coal shot rang out, shaking the calmness of the forest. Leila was startled, and she turned her head towards the direction of the sound. Surprised birds arose from the far side of the forest. One fell into the trees, with its wings drooping helplessly. The shots went on a few more rounds. Bill gave Leila a pat on her shoulder in an effort to calm the scared girl.
Leila.
Leila slowly raised her head. When their eyes met, Bill unconsciously held his breath. The child was crying. The Beautiful Bird Slaughterer. That was the title Leila Llewellyn decided to give him. All the people of this estate, even Bill Remmer, praised him for being a perfect aristocrat. People seemed to care and love Matthias von Earhart, who had outstanding qualities as the owner of this land. But Leila did not agree. Ever since the day the Duke went out hunting, the mother bird disappeared. The baby birds that had recently hatched no longer have their mother to feed them. In addition, countless birds were no longer to be seen. Why did the Duke hunt only small, beautiful birds instead of large birds that are meant to be eaten? Leila, who had been observing and agonizing for over the past month, now seemed to know why. To him, the birds were moving targets. The smaller they were, the more difficult and interesting they were to aim. The Duke did not bother to look at the prey he hit. He simply turned away after hitting his target. On the days he went out hunting, Leila buried the dead birds that were covered in blood. Bang! The gunfire rang once again in the distance. Chapter 3. Bring that girl here. The sun was scorching hot, but the tree shade was cool. Leila sat on a blanket with her arms wrapped around her knees. Bill and the other garden workers were engrossed in digging up the rose tree that had started to wilt. The garden behind the mansion seemed to have roses of all different sorts. The rose was said to be the national flower of the Berg Empire, and the flower that the Duke's mother and grandmother adored. Due to another day of gunshots coming from the forest, Leila wandered nervously around the cabin. Uncle Bill had seen her nervous state and decided to bring her out into the garden. Her mind was put to rest when the sound of gunshots faded away. Is it really okay for me to rest when Uncle Bill is working under the burning sun? Leila uncomfortably looked at Bill. She slowly closed her eyes and let out a small sigh. Uncle Bill threatened to get angry if she helped him. He told her he hated children who don't listen. Even though Leila's heart wasn't at ease, she decided to wait for him until he finished his job. When Leila opened her eyes again with resignation, she was startled by an unfamiliar boy standing in front of her. The neatly dressed boy looked like he was around Leila's age.
Hey!
When their eyes met, the boy greeted her with a lovely smile. He was a boy with charming platinum hair.
You live here?
The boy looked around and asked solemnly.
Yeah, with Uncle Bill.
Leila answered as she squinted her eyes.
Mr. Bill, you mean that scary gardener guy?
He's not scary.
Really? Seems scary to me.
The boy tilted his head and casually took a seat next to Leila.
Do you live here too?
Leila asked with caution. The boy smiled and shook his head.
Nah, I followed my father. He's the family doctor at the Hareheart household. He's here to give Madame Norma a medical examination. I come here with my father sometimes. Madame Norma said it was okay.
I see.
How old are you?
12.
Seen. But you're kinda small.
The boy, staring at Leila, began to laugh. Leila's cheeks started to flush bright red in fury.
You're small too.
I'm the tallest in my class, though.
The boy stretched out his back to prove his tall height. He certainly looked a little taller than his age.
Anyways, you're still shorter than Uncle Bill.
Leila whispered softly. The boy giggled again at Leila's words. He seemed like a happy-go-lucky child.
Hey, it's impossible to find a kid, or even an adult taller than Mr. Bill.
I'm not so sure about that.
Leila picked at the grass growing near the blanket for no reason. Her delicate fingers slowly tainted green. She wished the boy would quickly go away, but he showed no signs of getting up.
Do you want some?
Leila, who then focused her attention on the peach sitting at the edge of the blanket, asked impulsively. The boy gladly nodded. Leila took out a pocket knife from her leather bag. The boy snickered at the sight of Leila gently cutting the peach.
You're funny. Why is a knife coming out of a girl's bag?
Don't make fun of me. Uncle Bill gave it to me.
Leila slightly wrinkled her nose in annoyance as she gave the half-cut peach to the boy. The sweet scent of the peach pulp tingled two children's noses.
Why do you look so down? Did something happen?
The boy carefully asked after he gulped down his peach.
The Duke and his friends keep hunting down birds.
Leila somberly answered. The boy tilted his head, wondering what the issue was.
What about it?
They're murdering birds for their own enjoyment.
Isn't that how hunting works?
Do you think so too?
Leila stared at the boy with her stern green eyes. To Leila, the boy seemed like he would have a hard time holding the big long hunting gun.
No.
The boy shook his head violently.
I don't. It's cruel.
The boy replied. A smile gradually began to spread on Leila's face.
Do you want another peach?
Leila asked in a brighter voice. The boy nodded. Leila cut another peach in half and handed the larger piece to the boy. The boy's cheeks started to flush as he tried to fix his uncomfortable collar. Kyle, Kyle. A faint voice was heard. The boy, who was fiddling with the dead peach seed, sprang to his feet.
I have to go now.
Okay, bye.
Kyle Etman.
The boy held out his hand.
My name. What about you?
I'm Leila. Leila Llewellyn.
Leila awkwardly shook his hand. With their small hands covered in sticky peach nectar, the two shook hands as if they were making a truce.
Bye, Leila. See ya. I'll bring you something more delicious next time.
The boy shouted as he dashed away in the distance. Leila simply gave out a small wave, because she was unsure if she could see him again, if she ever stayed in this estate. When Kyle left, Leila's world was at peace again. While taking a whiff of the rose-scented breeze, Leila patiently waited for Uncle Bill to finish his work. But at some point, she had fallen asleep and opened her eyes to Uncle Bill calling her name at sunset. Leila rose up from her seat, carried her bag and picked up the blanket.
Uncle Bill, I saw a kid.
When Leila was about to tell her encounter with the boy who she shared her peaches with, she was interrupted by silhouettes of people walking out from the other side of the forest. It was Duke Hairhut and his friends. Matthias paused in the centre of the rose garden. The blunt gardener, Bill Remmer, was there bowing his head towards the Duke. It was not long before Matthias realized that there was a tiny child hiding behind the gardener.
Long time no see, Mr. Remmer.
Matthias slightly nodded. His acquaintances that were with him during his hunting session stopped behind the Duke at a moderate distance.
She's going to be staying here at Arvis for the time being.
Bill Remmer informed the Duke with a slightly uncomfortable look. When Bill tapped the girl's back to come forward, the girl hesitatingly took a step towards the Duke. Thanks to her sparkling blonde hair, Matthias was able to recall who the child was. The girl who he almost shot. The absurd little girl who almost got shot for being thought of as a bird.
I've already received approval from Madame Norma and Madame Elise, but I believe I should ask for your approval as well.
Bill Remmer bowed his head once again. The child standing beside him bowed along. Matthias slowly glanced at the child. When they exchanged looks, the child frowned at him. Thin, scowled eyes and clamped lips. Her expression was the exact same when they first met in the woods.
You're that girl. The girl who lives in the forest.
Matthias's cousin, Riette, snickered from behind. The red-faced child hid behind the gardener's back in embarrassment. The girl he occasionally met in the forest was like that as well. As soon as she stared into the Duke's eyes in wonder, she hid behind the tree, and after Matthias had finished hunting, she always came out from behind and buried the dead birds.
Sure. If that's what you want, Mr. Remmer.
Matthias gave a brief answer with a grin. Whatever the gardener raised in the forest was none of his business.
Thank you, my lord.
Bill gave him his thanks. After Matthias's chin ever so slightly nodded at Bill, he began to move. After the Duke passed the gardener and the girl by, Leila flinched at the sight of Matthias's servants following him with their hands full of hunted animals. The deep, unpleasant scent of blood ran through the girl's nose. Leila's shoulders hunched, and she closed her eyes. Uncle Bill's large worn hands patted Leila's frail shoulders. Claudine let out an exaggerated sigh, with her chin rested on the palm of her hand. Countess Brandt glanced at her daughter with her thin eyebrows. Claudine, behave like a lady, please. The Countess's inarticulate voice grew in impatience. Although Claudine was rather too young to be called a lady, she was soon to be the Duchess of Arvis. Claudine's mother let out a long sigh at her daughter's immature attitude.
But I'm so lonely and bored,
Claudine grumbled. The other noblewomen who were drinking tea at the tea table turned their eyes at the upset brunette girl. Then go play with your cousins, Countess Brandt huffed as her face turned crimson red. But Claudine did not bother to notice her frustrated mother.
They treat me as if I'm not here. They say things I don't understand.
The ladies let out a soft smile at Claudine's annoyed expression.
Well, it can be boring. Claudine doesn't have any friends her age.
Elise von Herhart nodded as she stroked the white dog sitting on her lap.
See? Madame Herhart understands.
A lively smile bloomed on Claudine's lip when she found someone who could understand her pain.
Who's that child?
Claudine suddenly directed her finger towards a garden after glancing at a young girl for some time. All the ladies turned their heads toward the direction Claudine was pointing at. The young girl Claudine was talking about was taking a stroll with a gardener.
Can I play with her? I think she's about the same age as me.
Well, isn't she an orphan from abroad? That kind of girl isn't suitable to be your friend.
I'm fine. I think it'll be more amusing than playing with a dog.
Claudine's tone was calm and imposing. She didn't pay any attention to her mother's red ears that were about to burst in embarrassment. Elise von Herhart laughed and happily rang the bell.
Bring me that child.
A maid arrived at the call of her master's bell.
The child the gardener is currently raising.
The maid brought Leila to an unknown world. It was a place where fancy people, dressed in candy-sweet-colored clothes, sat under the white mansion shade. "She's very cute," one of the ladies complimented.
What do you say? Do you like it, Claudine?
After examining Leila, the black-haired woman turned over to the chestnut-haired girl sitting beside her. The girl, named Claudine, smiled happily and nodded.
Thank you, Madam Herha.
Leila blankly stared at the people in front of her. She wasn't sure what the ladies were conversing about. She just wanted to get back to Uncle Bill's cabin, but no one seemed to notice her desperate desire. When one of the ladies murmured an order, the maid held Leila's hand and dragged her into a room. Leila had washed herself in a fancy bathroom for the first time and wore clothes that were surprisingly soft and white. The maid roughly combed her messy hair, but Leila endured the pain. She believed if she said something wrong, she would risk Uncle Bill's job.
Lady Claudine is the daughter of Count Brandt. You shouldn't act recklessly in front of her. Do you understand?
The maid who dragged Leila into the second floor of the mansion sternly warned Leila. Leila dazedly nodded. The maid cautiously opened the door of the drawing room. Claudine had greeted them with a posh attitude.
Hello, what's your name? Age?
Claudine lowered her head and attempted to make an eye contact with Leila.
Leila Llewellyn. I'm 12 years old.
Really? I thought you were younger since you're so small.
Although Leila hated being called small, she decided to hold in her frustration. For Uncle Bill. She calmed herself as she repeated those words like an incantation. Piano, music, floral arranging. Claudine recommended this and that. But there was nothing Leila could do. Dice game, word game, chess. The other alternatives proposed by Claudine were the same. A vague smile came upon Claudine's mouth as she alternately looked at the table, full of toys, and at Leila.
Poor you.
With a disappointed sigh, Claudine slowly rose from her chair. Leila stared helplessly at the toys assorted on the table.
You don't know a thing.
Claudine walked towards Leila's chair and sighed in resignation. Her soft voice, trying not to give any hints of disappointment or annoyance, gave Leila a greater humiliation. Leila thought she should at least answer something, but her mouth was closed shut. In a situation like this, it was hard to say anything polite. Fortunately, Claudine turned away without waiting for what Leila had to utter. Before closing the door, Claudine muttered aside to herself,
What the heck? No better than a dog.
When Claudine left, Leila was left all alone in the gleaming drawing room. Leila wanted to leave right away, but she decided to wait. Maybe she'll come back, Leila thought. But when the afternoon sun gradually ripened to a golden colour, Claudine did not return. The maid who brought Leila in did not show up until evening.
You may go back.
The maid's voice was softer than before.
The lady said you can keep the clothes. And this as well.
The maid extended a glittering gold coin towards Leila. When Leila froze in place, the maid shoved the coin into her hands.
Take it. It's polite to be thankful for what your superiors give you. Do you understand?